I want to make sure that it's working on Facebook this time. Last time when I went live, it did not work. Okay, yep, and it looks like we're live, so that's good. All right, so what's up, everyone? Welcome to Talking Christianity Apologetics. My name is Josh Gibbs, and tonight, this afternoon, we've got Randy Krakowski on with us again. And in this episode, we're going to be debating the origin of morality. So this should be a fun debate. It should be a good debate. And you should be familiar with Randy. But he's going to take the position that he's going to explain. He is a self-proclaimed atheist agnostic. And I'm going to give him the chance to kind of explain what that means. And what his story is as far as converting from or deconverting from Christianity to the position that he holds now. So stay tuned with us, and we will...
Make sure today that you leave this place knowing that you are saved to the glory of God.
Thinks that one I'm going to choose. If you believe that, friends, you don't know the gospel.
Is that the wonder of the cross is that no one gets injustice. If you end up under the wrath of God, it is because you've rejected his provision for you, and you are justly punished for your sin.
I think to what the scriptures teach. I think the Bible does teach that God desires the salvation of all men, and he has provided for the salvation of all men. And therefore, anyone who ends up under the wrath of God, it is because they have rejected his provision for them, and they are justly punished for their sins.
The question that seeks to provide an answer to this question: for whose sins did Jesus die? The extent of the atonement asks the question, for whose sins did Jesus die? There are only two possible answers to that question. Either Jesus died for the sins of some people, or Jesus died for the sins of all people.
All right, so welcome back. I appreciate you guys hanging in with us. Let's go ahead and get Randy on here so that he can join us, and we're going to get rolling. Awesome. So Randy, I've got you on the screen. Welcome back, man. It's good to have you on.
Thank you.
So, it's been a while since you and I last spoke in the last debate that we did, which if any of you who are viewing live right now and haven't had a chance to check that out, we debated whether or not God exists based off of the Kalam cosmological argument. So obviously I would have taken the affirmative and Randy would have taken the negative. And that was a really good debate, and I think that's part of the reason why we wanted to do this debate here tonight. I picked the last topic, and Randy picked tonight's topic, which is going to be the origin of morality. I'm going to take the position, obviously, that morality comes from God, specifically the God of Christianity, and Randy will take the position that it doesn't. So that's going to be a fun debate. We've kind of been going back and forth on Twitter a little bit, and he's brought up some good points, and hopefully we'll have some counter arguments for those that are worthy of your time to watch and listen and consider. And obviously when you have conversations like this, it's like Randy and I were talking before, it's like, at the end of the day, sometimes you get back into this kind of a circular conversation, and I don't think that we're going to end up doing that, but I think it'll be worth your time to stay with us and to listen to it and to share it and to like it and all of that good stuff. So before we get rolling and I give you the kind of the format for what this is going to look like, I want to give Randy a chance, for those of you who may not be familiar with him from our last episode, just to kind of explain a little bit about who he is, what his deconversion from Christianity looked like, what he's doing with his website now, and why it's so important to him to interact with Christians online when it comes to the conversation about God. So, Randy, if you could just kind of tell us everything that I just mentioned there, starting with who you are and what your deconversion looked like, and whatever else you want to share with us.
Yeah, thank you. So, I was raised here in Buffalo, New York, Roman Catholic, strict Roman Catholic, they call them cradle Catholics, and I moved to Maryland, so right into the Bible Belt a little bit, top of the Bible Belt, 1996, right when my first son was born. And my Catholicism waned a little bit. It kind of became more cultural as I got into my teen years. But when I was in my early 20s, I moved to Bethesda, near Bethesda, Maryland. I worked for a video game company called Bethesda Softworks. Any gamers would know that name. And I started listening on my 40-minute commutes about Charles Stanley and Hank Hanegraaff and Chuck Swindoll, and it's kind of struck me. I was drawn to it a little bit because like I said, I've been raised in a very religious household, and I listened to these guys talk, and it's like, wow, there's something. This stuff's defendable. It's defensible, So that piqued my interest. So later on that year, I quote unquote gave my life to the Lord. So from '96 to about 2015, I would say that I got not only became a Christian, but got really involved in apologetics. Just one of those people that always was interested in the truth. I always tell people I followed the truth no matter where it led. If it led to Buddhism, I'd be a Buddhist. If it led to Mormonism, I'd be a Mormon. But I always wanted to I just had a hunger for truth and figuring things out. So it's always been in my nature. I can actually go back to my grandfather and my father. We always were into, even though I'm a software developer, but I was always into figuring things out mechanically. I always work my hands when I'm not at work doing software development or website development. I'm figuring things out. So I was always searching for the truth, and raised my kids for the most part. My oldest is now 24. So from 1996, almost 20 years, I would call myself a Protestant fundamentalist Christian, evangelical Christian, and it started in Maryland in a part of the Bible Belt. So fast forward to 2015, I started remodeling my house to get it put up for sale, and I had a ton of work to do, and I said, you know what, I got a ton of work to do in this house. My kids have beat the heck out of it for 15, 16 years. I'm going to start listening to music. I got hours and hours, 80 hours worth of work. I'm listening. I said, you know what, my three boys, my youngest is a Christian. My oldest pretty much is. He was never really zealous about it, but my middle one was an atheist. My wife and my middle one were kind of atheists. So I said, what would the Lord have me do? If I'm going to, spend hours doing this, instead of listening to music or whatever, how about I kind of do research on atheism and start to understand arguments and where they're coming from, so I can reach my son and my wife, my middle son and my wife, if they ever have objections to this. Because they pretty much self-proclaimed atheists. My middle son, as much as he could as a teenager, said, Dad, I'm just not buying it. The whole story's kind of sketchy. And I, of course, as a Christian father, I was kind of upset. I'm like, who are you to tell me? I'm, 35 years old. I'm older than you are. Obviously, if it was false or something, I would know about it. So regardless, I figured the Lord would have me kind of just do research and equip myself to come up with the best response to an atheist wife and to an atheist son. So fast forward 9, 10, 12 months, I'm remodeling my house. I'm listening to every debate I could, every podcast, every debate, and it kind of started chipping away. Just the arguments, I always was taught and listened to Christian apologetics. It's almost like a slam dunk argument. Obviously, just look at the trees. There's the designer. Just look at DNA. Just look at a cell. But as I'm listening to these debates and that, and as the top theologians are going against the top scientists, I'm not hearing convincing arguments from the theological side. And the more research I do on it, I see that theological arguments are kind of falling apart. They're more wishful thinking. They're not. So I started talking to a good friend who was a youth pastor. I started talking to my current pastor at my church, and he said, well, what are you trying to say? They both kind of, it was funny because they both kind of had the same conclusion. They said, what are you trying to say? Are you trying to say they're lying, that they're being dishonest? And I'm thinking, like, you know what? Based on what I'm hearing, whenever I follow up on something, whenever something's contested in a debate and I go and do research on it, I find out that they're using a quote from Darwin that had sections omitted, or it's out of context, or it's from a Ken Ham website, some kind of like Kent Hove and Ken Ham like pseudo-scientific website. This is kind of annoying. So that's when I started, and I think it was 2018. I started documenting all this stuff, and I said, you know what, this is a bunch of garbage. I'm kind of tired of all these half-truths, and a lot of these apologetics are on the radio and are doing debates and that, like the William Lane Craig Sam Harris debate. I think they both got paid like $25,000 to do that debate at Notre Dame. I said, this is ridiculous. I just don't understand how these people can get away with this for, doing misquotes and half-truths and fudging science and showing different conclusions than what the actual scientist had said, concluded. So that was kind of where the website was birthed. I started documenting this like in a Word doc, and then eventually I said, this has to be a website at some point. This is nuts. And so that's where lionforjesus.org came, because it's basically people, in my estimation, trying to protect their investment. They've put their life into something, they've gone too far, they're in it with both feet, and instead of saying, you know what, time out, some of this isn't adding up, they kind of double down and say, you know what, I can find an old scientist from the 1800s that will support what I think. I can find this website, Answers in Genesis, that can support what I think. So that site now is I think it's 7 or 8 famous apologists that have lied about different things, whether it's their credentials, whether it's about evolution, whether it's about homosexuality. They basically just lied about things. And then just this past week, I launched a new section called Evidence-Based Memes. And what that's doing is basically a popular meme. I'm going to take one a month, and I'm going to put a meme up that is circulating around the internet that people may or may not have seen, and I'm going to document the validity of it. And I did one. I launched it, I think, just Wednesday or Thursday. I launched one. We can talk about that later if we ever get into it. But the website's probably going to have that feature now, like evidence-based memes, because people circulate these memes, and do you know if they're true or not? So that can get annoying if it's a kind of like a Christian propaganda or atheist propaganda type of meme. To me, that's annoying because you're still not getting the truth when you have that kind of stuff. You're just making a characterization of, or caricature of Christianity or a caricature of atheism. I want the actual truth. Is there facts behind this, or is it someone just trying to, again, lie and fudge the truth to make a point, and basically to make their own agenda? So hope I didn't talk too fast there, but I tried to put 25 years into 5 minutes.
No, you're good, man. I do appreciate that. And one thing, before we get rolling, I do want to say, obviously you've got a lot of conviction for why you believe what you believe now, and it has a lot to do with your experience of what Christianity has kind of been as far as the experience for you personally, as well as for your family. And when it comes to this website, you and I had talked the last time about kind of what the purpose of it was, and I had asked you, do you think that this disproves Christianity? And your response was, are you the guy who messaged me about whether or not this disproves Christianity? Because you had told me there was somebody when you and I had that conversation that literally had brought that up with you so recently that you thought it might be me, which it wasn't. But obviously the website's not presupposing or supposing that it provides evidence to show that Christianity isn't true, but to you it shows kind of the backside or the hypocrisy of Christianity, of which I think that it's good for people to look into this stuff and see whether or not it's true or whether or not it's false. So that would be my perspective on it. But if there's anything that you want to piggyback on that before we jump into kind of what the structure for our debate is going to look like, let's hit that first.
I guess the only thing I could say would be that if Christianity is true, or if a version of Christianity is true, it's not true for the reasons that these guys, that popular theologians are saying. It's not true because it's a defeater or an answer or a valid opposition to biological evolution. It gets a little bit more complex than that, because like Ravi Zacharias, world-renowned apologist, quote-unquote intellectual, and the guy who started Ravi Watch, which I've been in contact with, and I have permission to link to his site and use some of his research. He was convincing atheists. He had converted atheists in the past, and even this guy, I think his name is Stephen. If you ever go to RaviWatch.com, it's pretty amazing how he's fooled millions of people into thinking that he has doctorate degrees and he's a doctor of philosophy and theology and things like that, and he studied under a great physicist. None of it ends up being true. He's actually gotten to even more problem now. He was having a kind of like a sexting affair with a woman in her congregation that he is denying, but then she showed the actual evidence of their conversation, stuff like that, and he threatened suicide if she came out, and all this stuff. But anyway, it's so what got Steve to start RaviWatch.com was he heard Ravi's arguments and said, and he looked at Ravi's credentials and said, this guy has years and years of studying. He knows all about this stuff. There might be something to this Christianity thing. But as he dug deeper, he found the arguments really didn't hold water, and then he found that Ravi really didn't have degrees. So there's this form of Christianity that is kind of like evangelizing a secular world for the worse, and the tactics they're using, I think, need to be exposed. So I guess to put it in a nutshell, if there's a version of Christianity that's true, it's not the version that these famous theologians that are on the radio and on TV today are espousing.
Yeah. And I'll say this, kind of as my last comment before we jump into it. I don't think that any Christian would obviously espouse that we live perfect lives, or like we're not hypocrites, or that we don't have certain things about our lives that, I mean, in my opinion, you know what, I'm a sinner. There's so much about my life that is not perfect. There's things that I've lied about. There's things that I do that are not good. And obviously those are things that can hurt your testimony as a Christian, but I think at the end of the day that what we're espousing for when it comes to what we believe in is not hinged off of the credibility of our own witness, but the witness of Christ. And so with that said, I want to put the format for what the debate is going to look like up on the screen for you all. It's going to be 25 minutes each for Randy and then for myself to lay out our personal position and address any supposed issues with the opposing view. Then we'll transition to 10 minutes of cross-examination each after we do our introductions. That'll be followed by 5-minute rebuttals, and then 7 minutes open dialogue before we go to 3-minute closing statements each. So let me ask you, Randy, would you like to go first or second? And I can get the timer up on the board for our first 25 minutes.
Actually, I probably would prefer to go first, because my fear is that I'm going to be too consumed with with responses to your opening that I'm not going to get through mine or something.
Okay.
So I guess to save me from myself.
Okay, you got it. Let me get the timer up here. And 25 minutes. Okay, sweet. And you're ready to go? Have at it whenever you're ready.
All right, so the origins of morality. So survival and reproduction. The goal of survival and reproduction is as old as the first single-celled organism that emerged on this planet over 3 billion years ago. Now, fast forward through time from 3 billion years ago to about 215 million years ago, when the first mammals began to emerge. We find survival and reproduction as the main goals still, but eventually we discover more complex organisms that we call mammals, with genes that produce new chemicals called oxytocin and vasopressin. Those chemicals allow mammals to have the capacity for affection, to care for their young. And in some mammals, such as humans, those same chemicals encourage the formation of long-term relationships and bonding. So enter kin selection. Kin selection, also known as biological altruism. With these more complex mammals, we begin to observe kin selection. Kin selection is the evolutionary process that favors the reproductive success of an organism species as a whole, even at the cost of the organism's own survival and reproduction. The final arbiter of evolution is actually not fitness. Most people think better, faster, stronger. Rather, it's the passing on of one's genes in most cases. Kin selection is when animals behave in a way that allows them to protect the kin around them, even at the risk of the animal itself. So it's broadened from individual gene passing on to actual group of genes passing on. So, for instance, white-tailed deer, ground squirrels, bees, they all in biology they all express this kin selection. A white-tailed deer. Here in New York, we have deer everywhere in our backyards and the street. It's just, there's so many deer. Anyways, they're brown, and they live in tall brown grass and tall brown woods. But when there's a predator that comes, and there's a few of them, they'll actually flip their tails up, which are bright white, and they'll run, and they'll try and distract the predator. Even if it means one of them gets killed, their kin pass on that gene that allows their kin to survive another day. Ground squirrels, very similar. They have bright tail undersides. They also emit like a screech. Even if the predator doesn't see them first, they'll actually emit a screech, and they'll draw the predator to them and sacrifice themselves. Bees actually disembowel themselves. In the interest of the hive, they'll actually go and disembowel themselves and sting someone and sacrifice their lives to save the hive, so that genetic information is passed on. If a behavior saves multiple of its kin, more genetic information of that species gets passed on. Kin selection also happens with insects. As I mentioned before, some insects like bees and that are born sterile. Their only purpose is to protect the kin so that they may pass on genetic information. Through time, these genes in mammals do things like, through time, these genes result in mammals doing things like sharing food with one another, gathering for safety, rearing young together, building communities and relationships together, and this induces compassion, sympathy, empathy, guilt, and even love. In his book, The Moral Animal, author and professor of science and religion at Union Theological Seminary, Robert Wright, notes that if one ape receives even a single gene mutation that allows it to love its offspring more than other apes, you may not notice it in a single generation, but if that gene provides just a slight survival advantage over other apes' offspring, that species, more importantly, that genetic information is going to continue to thrive. Over time and generations, that population of apes is going to be slightly more compassionate than the population that came before it. Likewise, with humans, we do good for one another, like saving someone's life, even if we don't know the person. It's innate within us by way of natural selection in an effort to pass on genes of our species. In early humans, spreading genes meant working with your neighbors, having a sense of which behaviors were acceptable and which were not. Speaking of early humans, Stony Brook biology professor George C. Williams says, if an individual who maximizes his friendships and minimizes his antagonisms, that individual will have an evolutionary advantage. Selection will favor those characteristics that promote optimization of personal relationships. And then Robert Wright again goes on to say, animals, including humans, often execute evolutionary logic, not via conscious calculation, but by following their feelings, which can often lead to logical executors. One example would be when you see a person with their hands full at a store, you go and you get the door for them. And you don't ask yourself, wait, do they have genes that I would like to see passed on in our species? You just act on it. It's built within our DNA. Now, in the last century or two, as we advanced technologically, we built up upon cooperation, working together and maximizing well-being of others, helping all of humanity instead of just our kin, reducing harm as much as possible for as many people as possible. This is why our morals are so strikingly similar to one another, regardless of our situation and our religious view. A Buddhist would hold the door just like a Christian would, just like a Muslim would, just like an atheist would. And then eventually, as human communication and reflection became more advanced, ethical theories were formulated that turned care for others into universal principles. As in the policy that morality is based on, the rights of all people and the consequences that affect everyone. Patricia Churchland, professor of philosophy at University of California, summarizes like this. Moral norms are shaped by four interlocking brain processes: caring, recognition of others' psychological states, learning social practices, and problem solving in a social context. Hence, the origins of morality are both neural and social. Attempts to improve society by making it more responsive to people's needs should consider all these processes. It's not a coincidence that the more complex a mammal is, the more rational that species is. The more rational that species is, the more able it is to adhere to moral norms. And it has the ability to often reason out what the moral thing is to do in a given circumstance. Anthropologists notice that many species of mammal are extremely social when compared to reptiles, fish, arthropods, etc. Mammals feel angst when they are separated, they groom each other, they console each other, they grieve the death of close individuals, they share food, they hunt in a concerted fashion, and they cooperate in defense. And this is all mammals. It's not even speaking of humans at this point. We're talking about lower primate mammals. Scientists attribute this to unique warm-bloodedness. Gram for gram, warm-blooded creatures have to consume 10 times as many calories as cold-blooded creatures due to endothermy, basically their warm-bloodedness. The environmental pressure of having to catch and consume that much food also caused generations that survived to possess scaled-up intelligence. The learning mechanisms that evolved from reptiles have been scaled up as they have evolved into mammals. And if you look at evolutionary, it goes, single-celled organisms into fish, into amphibians, into reptiles, into mammals, which we are now. Just for anyone who, if I'm talking too fast. So the learning mechanisms evolved from reptiles that have been scaled up as they evolved into mammals. What this evolved into is the learning part of the brain called the cerebral cortex. It's a 6-layer structure that mammals have that non-mammals do not have. It can get larger as the species evolves. In order for one to make the most of the cortex, it has to be born at a very immature age and take a long time to mature. Thus, it lends itself to feeding the cortex and allowing the cortex to develop. On average, it takes 25 years for a human cortex to fully develop. And anyone who has teenagers at home will understand this, that their brain is in a very strange state. They're physically big enough to be responsible and to protect themselves, but mentally they're kind of, that cortex isn't developed yet. Anyone who's pre-25 or has kids pre-25, that teenage year span is very, very testing. So this long maturity requires mammals to take care of their young very closely. It allows social bond in the species from birth. It also pressures the scope of the species to expand from the me to me and mine mentality. This is what causes sociality. You don't see this in reptiles, amphibians, etc. With non-mammals, the parents are normally long gone. With the exception of a few reptiles and amphibians, they kind of lay the eggs. They kind of, once they're hatched in that, they kind of take off on them. It's mammals that rear their young and stay with them a long time. Enter acceptation. Acceptation, E-X-A-P-T-A-T-I-O-N. Many people might not have heard of it. Mother Nature, as she often does, she takes an old mechanism and repurposes it. So this is called acceptation. Feathers are a classic example. They were initially a genetic mutation that stuck because they're beneficial for thermal regulation, aka keeping warm. But later, due to environmental pressures, they gradually proved useful for flight. With mammals, as I mentioned, we see the existence of oxytocin and vasopressin. They emerged as useful for mother-infant bonding initially. However, they further evolved into pair bonding between mammalian parents. They are responsible for sociality and pair bonding. How women now see men is an acceptation of how they initially saw their infants. And how men see women is an acceptation of how men viewed women, or how men see women as an acceptation of how they viewed and were attached to territory and property. The functions of vasopressin include promoting pair bonding, territoriality, selective aggression toward mating competition. Oxytocin triggers maternal behavior, promotes pair bonding, reduces vigilance of unfamiliar mating competition in loving primates, and promotes cooperation between unrelated humans. These and other chemicals are responsible for doing a fundamental work of sociality and making us bond and attach and want to help one another. And then the last part of my intro is enter social cooperation. Humans, species that thrive in our capacity. I'm sorry, there's an echo. Enter social cooperation. Humans are the kind of species that thrive on our capacity when we have a cooperative endeavor. If we didn't, we would have already died out and we wouldn't be here discussing this. The environment of this planet favored the survival of those who were compassionate and cooperative. Experiments have been done with toddlers. They've been observed to favor friendly puppets over mean puppets. They will even help individuals that drop their keys when their hands are full. A toddler will actually pick up them and try and hand them back to an individual, even if the individual is a stranger. It's not an aunt or uncle or parent. We see the same exact behavior in chimpanzees and bonobos, who also have pro-social moral tendencies. And what that is, morality is a sense of right and wrong, a sense of fairness, a sense of equality. And how I have morality defined is it's a system of ideas about right and wrong conduct to discover what's in its best own interest. All you need for a moral system is a desire to do good, a goal of good, and understanding what good is. When we assess a moral valuation of something, it's the consequences of an action in this case, in humans' case, the goal is well-being. Whether you're religious or not, if you're secular or religious, your goal is still going to be well-being. And morality has to do with not only behavior but also intentions. Well-being is a standard for morality, and survival, equality, autonomy are building blocks and a guide to morality. I would also add liberty. So survival, equality, liberty, autonomy are building blocks and a guide to morality. And I just wanted to play that one video, just so this doesn't sound. I know I kind of was like drink out of a fire hose. I put 2 weeks of thought into 7 minutes, but I just want this to sound like it's something out there that's strange. I think this video, it's 2.5 minutes. If I still have 2.5 minutes left, I can show this video that it's capuchin monkeys, and they're obviously not human. They don't have what a religious person would call a soul. They're not endowed with some kind of soul or soulment or a supernatural bent. They don't recognize Jesus. They don't recognize Muhammad. They don't recognize Lord Krishna. But yet they still have a sense of fairness. They still have a sense of morality. They still have a sense of navigating what's right and wrong in their species, what's fairness, what equality is. So I can play this video whenever we're ready.
Yeah, you got it whenever you want to. If you're sharing your screen, you should be able to do it anytime.
How do I go about that?
In Skype, there's an option. Yep. There's 2 squares down in the bottom right corner. If you click that, it'll allow you to share screen. Yeah, there we go. At least I can see the Skype emblem. I can't see you anymore, but you're definitely doing something.
All right, I think we're good.
Not yet. We can just see the Skype emblem.
Yeah, no, I didn't open it yet, but
okay.
I'm successfully sharing.
Oh, I see. Sweet. Yeah. Whenever you're ready, then.
Can you hear that and everything?
No, I can't hear anything, and I can't see anything either. If you want to, you can send me the link, and I could play it on my end.
Yeah, we'll just do that.
Okay, let me pause Is it on YouTube, I take it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's cancel that. I'll go back to. How do I get it? Or how do I send you the link? Okay, I got it.
Okay. Okay, for those of you who are watching, sorry about that. I'm gonna try to get this up. And what minute mark do I go to?
You can play the whole thing. It's like 2.5 minutes. It should be pretty fast.
Alright, give me just a second. I'm gonna start this over and share the screen with you folks watching at home. Okay.
I'll also give you $5 if you don't
So
laugh.
the final experiment that I want to mention to you is our fairness study. And so this became a very famous study, and there's now many
that's
more.
lagging really
After
bad.
We did this about 10 years ago. It became very well known. And we did that originally with capuchin monkeys, and I'm going to experiment.
Oof.
We did. It has now been done with dogs, and with birds, and with chimpanzees. But with Sarah Brosnan, we started out with capuchin monkeys. So what we did is we put two capuchin monkeys side by side. Again, these animals, they live in a group. They know each other. We take them out of the group, put them in a test chamber. And there's a very simple task that they need to do. And if you give both of them cucumber for the task, the two monkeys side by side, they're perfectly willing to do this 25 times in a row. So cucumber, even though it's really only water in my opinion, but cucumber is perfectly fine for them. Now if you give the partner grapes, the food preferences of my capuchin monkeys correspond exactly with the prices in the supermarket. And so if you give them grapes, that's a far better food, then you create inequity between them. So that's the experiment we did. Recently we videotaped it with new monkeys.
You know what? I'm gonna stop that. That audio is just so bad, man. There's a massive lag going in here, so I'm gonna cut this back to you and put you on the screen. If you could bring the camera back to you on Skype.
Can you try it?
Yeah, if you want to, if you can, that'd be fine. But it's just, it's not even. It's gonna be awful for anybody that's viewing it. So. Unless you just want to give a rundown on what it was about.
You think it'll do the same thing for me if I play it?
No, I don't. I think it's got to be. It's got to be something on my
You're running
end.
too much. You're running a lot of stuff at once. Is that why? Maybe.
Yeah, I think so.
Eating up all your bandwidth.
Yeah.
All right. Let me try. So yes, let me try that. If I. Okay, so if I go back to those boxes, I choose Chrome tab, share. Let me know if this works.
Yep, we've got it. Okay, you're good. I just can't hear anything. Yeah, we can see it, we just can't hear it, Randy.
Yeah, that would be a problem. So what would, do I like not have my volume on?
Well, yeah, you would have to have the volume coming through either your system if you've got your headphones plugged into the system, or if you well, you've got your headset for your mic, so.
So if I unplug that, will it work?
Yeah, I think that it would work if you unplug your headset and just play the volume. But if it doesn't, let's just have you give us a rundown, and that'll be
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's working.
So a final experiment that I want to mention to you is our fairness study. And so this became a very famous study, and there's now many more, because after we did this about 10 years ago, it became very well known. And we did it originally with capuchin monkeys, and I'm going to show you the first experiment that we did. It has now been done with dogs, and birds, and with chimpanzees. But with Sarah Brosnan, we started out with capuchin monkeys. So what we did is we put two capuchin monkeys side by side. Again, these animals, they live in a group. They know each other. We take them out of the group, put them in a test chamber. And there's a very simple task that they need to do. And if you give both of them cucumber for the task, the two monkeys side by side, they're perfectly willing to do this 25 times in a row. So cucumber, even though it's really only water in my opinion, but cucumber is perfectly fine for them. Now, if you give the partner grapes, the food preferences of my capuchin monkeys correspond exactly with the prices in the supermarket. And so, if you give them far better food, then you create inequity between them. So that's the experiment we did. Recently, we videotaped it with new monkeys who never done the task, thinking that maybe they would have a stronger reaction, and that turned out to be right. The one left is right grape. The one who gets cucumber, note that the first piece of cucumber is perfectly fine. The first piece he eats. Then she sees the other one getting grape, and you will see what happens. So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber, and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets the grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber. She tests her rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again. So this is basically the Wall Street protest that you see here.
Yep. So that's it.
Okay.
So I just wanted to go back to. I guess I can stop. Yeah. So that I just wanted that kind of ties in my intro. I want to show that sense of fairness, equality, liberty.
Can we get your video back by chance? And I can't hear you either. Okay, I can hear you again, but we can't see you. Or at least I heard something.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, I can hear you. Just can't see you yet.
And
yeah, down in the bottom of, in the center, you should have a video button.
There we go.
There we go. Okay.
Yeah, sorry. The last time I used Skype was with you, so not a frequent flyer. So I guess just to summarize, the reason I wanted to show that was it kind of tied in my intro that the sense of fairness, liberty, equality, it's innate within organisms, especially mammals. The more complex and the more sentient and sapient a mammal becomes, the more the larger sense of equality, and that we see that with lower primates. We see that with I even think some insects even, but obviously with humans being at the top of the the food chain, so to speak, and with those capuchin monkeys and that, you see, I mean, they were exhibiting virtually almost sapient behavior at that point. The one on the right was saying, listen, or on the left was saying, listen, I'm doing the same task. At one point, you even see her like testing the rock, like, did I not complete the task? You could kind of make an analogy to a workplace thing with humans. I did the same amount of work. I deserve the same amount of pay. It's immoral to give me something different. So, long story short, that sense of fairness and morality and right and wrong and equality is innate within all organisms on this planet, at least, and especially as you get to complex mammals like ourselves.
Okay. Awesome, man. So is that going to be a wrap for your introduction then?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Let me get to my notes, and I'll put the clock up for me. I'll have 25 minutes. And then I'll get rolling on my side. Okay. Cool. Awesome. Yeah, thanks again, Randy, for coming on. I do appreciate you being willing to do another debate with me. And being that this is the topic that you picked, I am really excited to have this conversation for a lot of reasons, especially now I didn't know what to expect on who was going to go first or second, and I'm totally fine going second because it does give me a little bit more of an understanding on what your position is within the naturalist worldview. So let me start with this statement, and then I'll build on it from there. The evil in the world presupposes a perfect standard. C.S. Lewis begins Mere Christianity with the premise that an objective moral law, such as even common disagreements, presupposes and entails a moral lawgiver. There is something which is directing the universe, and which appears in me as a law urging me to do right, and making me feel responsible and uncomfortable when I do wrong. I think we have to assume it's more like a mind than it is like anything else we know, because after all, the only thing we know is matter, and you can hardly imagine a bit of matter giving instruction. Now, those are the words of C.S. Lewis, but I want to follow up with this. The first thing, when we're talking about morality, and specifically the origin of morality, one thing that I think that we need to recognize is the first thing is realize what moral arguments are claiming and what they're not claiming. So some of the things that the morality argument is not claiming would be, we're not claiming as theists to be more moral than atheists. It's not claiming that atheists cannot be moral people. We're not claiming that atheists cannot know anything about morality. We're not claiming atheists cannot have some good reasons for their moral choices. We're not claiming that morality cannot appear to arise from natural processes, and we're not claiming that objective morals are or have to be universally agreed. Most supposed refutations of the moral argument on the internet, they only attend to those 6 straw man arguments. And I don't believe that Randy actually did any of those. He just gave a positive presentation for where he believes morality has originated through an evolutionary process. And I can totally respect his perspective on it, but I do believe that it is lacking. And I'm hoping to draw that out as we go along here. So there is a moral law. This debate is about the origin of morality, and not necessarily whether or not there is a God. Since you all know that I'm taking the position of a Christian, I will presuppose the necessity for God in my argument, although I'll make a case that morality necessitates the existence of a transcendent moral lawgiver. I'll stick to the argument for the origin of morality, as opposed to an explanation for the existence of God as much as possible. Now, since the Christian God is a moral being, and since humankind is created in God's image, a moral corollary of theism is that the ultimate duty of people is to obey moral law, having originated from the moral lawgiver, and is written in our scripture to be written on the hearts of all men. This law is absolutely binding since it comes from God. It is over and above any human laws. It is prescriptive and not merely descriptive, as are all laws of nature. Rewards and punishment await. Each individual life, like all of history, is pointed towards an end or a goal. Human moral actions have necessary consequences in how one adheres to the moral law, yet this adherence to moral law is not the basis of one attaining eternal life within the Christian worldview. Some modern theists minimize or even negate the punishment aspect of human destiny and hope that all might be saved or at least annihilated if unsaved. But traditional theists believe this is wishful thinking. The Bible teaches that Christians will be judged based on their faith in Jesus Christ as their personal Savior, which I'm guessing we will get to probably the sacrifice of Jesus, or in the morality behind eternal punishment at some point in this debate, and perhaps the conversation and the dialogue portion, to determine whether or not that was in fact good or evil. Now, all theists do acknowledge a day that will bring about justice. This is what we call evaluation or judgment. Many non-theists do literally believe that theism is too good to be true. Sigmund Freud, in fact, wrote, quote, "We say to ourselves, it would indeed be very nice if there were a God, who was both creator of the world and a benevolent providence. If there were a moral world order and a future life, but at the same time it seems very odd that this all is just as we wish it ourselves. The real question, of course, is not how satisfying a view is, but whether or not it is true. Many non-theists believe that it is not true. And the very nature of morality, it's one of which necessitates justice for any evil. Randy spoke about this in his presentation. If one were to ask what good and evil is, that is the nature of epistemology and not one of ontology. This debate should focus on the ontology rather than the epistemology. So I'm going to give two arguments in two different forms for the moral argument, and Randy can decide which he would like to argue against. C.S. Lewis's argument is 4 points. First, there must be an objective, universal moral law, or else no ethical judgments make any sense. Nothing could be called evil or wrong and there would be no reason to keep promises or treaties. 2. This moral law does not originate with us. In fact, we are bound by it. 3. The source of this law is more like mind than matter, and it cannot be part of the universe any more than an architect can be part of the building he designs. 4. Therefore, there exists a moral lawgiver who is the ultimate source and standard of all right and wrong. Now, the second argument, this is going to be a more basic argument, the one that majority of you all have probably heard, is point number 1, premise 1. Moral laws require a moral lawgiver. 2, there is an objective moral law. And then 3, therefore there is a moral lawgiver which transcends the origin of these moral laws. Now, let's break this down a bit. Morality is evidence... Daddy! Sissy. Say hi to everybody who's watching right now. We're talking about morality. Hey, go back up with Mom, okay? I'll be done in just a minute. Can you wait for me? Do I get a hug? Can I have a hug? Oh, I love you. Alright, go back up with Mom and I'll play with you in a minute, okay?
Come on.
Alright.
Come on.
Thank you. You look pretty. Okay, so let's break that down a little bit. The morality. Depending on which argument you want to go with, it really doesn't matter. Either one of those is going to be broken down by these subpoints. So subpoint 1 is going to be morality is a rational enterprise. 2 is moral realism is true, meaning moral facts and values exist. Moral problems and disagreements among humans are too great for us to assume moral facts and values are grounded in a human source of rationality. That's a huge point. 4, moral facts and values are grounded in a necessary rational source. 5, this source is what we call God, and therefore God must exist to have moral law. Now, to have morality, one must have a nature and capacity by which they can choose between good and evil, uncoerced, having an understanding of the nature of what is good and the consequences of one's evil actions. This formula comes from Braxton Hunter, of which Jonathan Pritchett sent this to me to use in this debate in particular. It goes like this. Premise 1, if God does not exist, then libertarian free will does not exist. Premise 2, libertarian free will does exist. So conclusion, therefore God exists. The subpoints for this argument would go like this, and I came up with these. 1 is God has free will. 2, God created man in his image. So 3, God granted man free will at the creation of Adam and Eve. 4, Adam and Eve chose evil. 5, man never lost free will after the fall. And 6, man has a choice between good and evil today in a nature by which they are able to choose between good and evil. Okay, so now you've seen a positive presentation for why I believe what I believe about morality and how it originates back to the moral lawgiver being the God of Christianity. So let's talk about a few of the problems with the naturalist model. These would be the problems that Randy holds to and what he actually espoused in his presentation. So first, the naturalist does not account for what we call oughts. It only accounts for what is. That is, Randy can tell you what his perception of what right and wrong is, but he cannot account for where right and wrong originated. That would be the ought. Everything is ultimately determined in the naturalist worldview, as we will see. You have to have something outside of knowledge of what is right and wrong in order to determine whether or not these naturalistically, genetically determined molecules in motion have any grounding for determining what is moral, that is, what one ought to do. In other words, for the sake of analogy, it would be like saying you know that you are in a dream. The only way to know that you are in a dream is to come out of that dream in order to claim that you were in fact in a dream. It's the same for your argument on the origin of morality within an evolutionary perspective. You have to have some grounds to establish the truth of this moral claim that is outside of the nature of the claim itself. You cannot do this within an evolutionary model if everything is determined by one's genetic makeup. You are only dancing to your DNA and have no way of stepping outside of quote-unquote what is to determine what one ought to do. Now, the naturalist cannot account for consciousness or what Randy called sentience as it relates to the origin of morality. Without an account of consciousness or sentience, one has no grounds to establish morality. Now, consciousness is the quality or state of being aware of an external object or something within oneself. It's been defined as subjectivity, awareness, sentience, the ability to experience or to feel, wakefulness, having a sense of selfhood, and the executive control system of the mind. In 2004, there were 8 neuroscientists who felt it was too soon for a definition of consciousness. They were quoted in the publication of The Human Brain Function in saying, quote, "We have no idea how consciousness emerges from the physical activity of the brain, and we do not know whether consciousness can emerge from non-biological systems, such as computers." Unquote. The prominent atheist Richard Dawkins in The Selfish Gene notes, quote, "The evolution of the capacity to simulate seems to have culminated in subjective consciousness. Why this should happen is, to me, the most profound mystery facing modern biology." Unquote. This, of course, begs the question, can non-conscious matter produce human consciousness, and how do you get consciousness from subconsciousness? Now, New York University philosopher and atheist Thomas Nagel wrote an entire book on the subject called Mind and Cosmos, Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False. Though he remains an atheist, he argues that the theory of evolution is inadequate to account for the undeniable reality of human consciousness. If you would even take Daniel Dennett's approach and say that your consciousness is just an illusion, you would have to have some means by which you can step out and away from your consciousness in order to determine whether or not it is in fact an illusion. If not, it is again a subjective interpretation of your consciousness as we compare this to stepping out of your moral framework to determine what is moral. You have to have something that transcends morality to determine what is morally good. And Randy does not have this within his moral model, but he is claiming to presuppose consciousness and the origin of consciousness within an evolutionary model that no other evolutionary biologist or scientist or neurobiologist or cosmologist can come up with. So this is a very novel idea that Randy is espousing himself that it seems no one agrees with. Sam Harris says this, quote, "The rewarding conscious states constitute human flourishing should be available to all, not just a privileged few. It's an objective moral truth certified by science that we should seek, quote, the heights of happiness for the greatest number of people," unquote. And that's on page 28 of his book. Some conceptions of morality prevent many from flourishing, so there's a disparity between what some believe about morality and moral reality. Human flourishing should be universal, unquote. But here's the problem with this. Science does not establish for anyone that it's morally incumbent on them, as opposed to instrumentally useful, to endorse the flourishing of all. So even if Sam can come up with a moral code like Randy has, it does not establish the ontology of morality, just the usefulness of morality employed to societal goals. It can help specify means to achieve ends, given basic non-instrumental values, but it cannot prescribe such values. To assert a basic moral imperative is to be gripped by a conception of the good, not to discover one's values in the fabric of the cosmos as we do elementary particles and natural laws. Now, if your thoughts and actions are determined by your DNA, then you have no reason to trust the very thoughts themselves, and certainly the grounds by which you can get any justice for evil, and thereby you must reject the evolutionary grounds by which one comes to understand what is and what is not moral. Evolution does not get you to morality. If anything, it only is descriptive of what you perceive to be reality and not prescriptive. Of which I, of course, reject the premise that evolution is a tenable explanation for one, biology, or two, the origin of life, and by necessity, the origin of morality, having failed in its premise. Not only that, but Randy would have us believe his own version of the origin of morality, which is something that not even his own camp would agree on. You all don't agree with each other on either what is moral or the origin of morality. So, and I'm not trying to be divisive here, I'm just trying to come up with a suggestion that this would be very helpful. If you guys, as atheists, agnostics, and skeptics, I would put this challenge out to you. Come up with your own universal code of ethics. Be in agreement within your own camp on what that code of ethics is, and then you would have an origin of your morality, and then we can actually have a conversation that would be more productive in comparing your perspective to the Christian perspective. Right now, it's the Christian perspective versus Randy's personal view on both. So, any argument for the origin of morality within the naturalist model, or any subcategory of that, is relying upon less obvious premises, less probable than objective morality from a moral lawgiver. Randy's foundation is built upon unprovable premises, which by necessity begs the question of ontology for morality. If the evolutionary model is true, it only accounts for your thoughts on morality and not the origin of morality itself. Again, it is an epistemology versus ontology, and that is the topic of today's discussion. One is the study of truth, and the other is the origin of that truth. In this case, both sides are seeking to establish a higher probability for our respective model on the origin of morality, that is, our ontological model. Now let's talk about some of the objections to the moral argument that I just presented. The most common is going to be what's called the Euthyphro Dilemma, which some argue that because evil exists, God does not exist, or at least an all-powerful, all-loving God does not exist. Now, I got to take a drink real quick. To make this argument, the arguer makes an assumption that there is an objective moral law. Otherwise, the definition of what is evil becomes subjective, rendering the argument itself pointless. Similarly, some argue that the God of the Bible is evil based on their own definition of what is good, and major misconceptions about the Bible on top of that. Now, this too renders the argument pointless, as the argument requires the objectivity of morality to be valid. To live as Christ, it is always the means that justify the ends, yet the means never violate the moral law. The Euthyphro dilemma presented by Socrates essentially says this, quote, "Is something good because the gods will it, or did the gods will something because it is good?" Unquote. The question actually appears to present a false dichotomy as the answer to the dilemma is God's will, if God wills something because he is good. It is almost as though Socrates recognized that, quote, gods they believed in were not enough, that some ultimate standard for good had to exist, that standard would have to be a God of the gods. An argument often used against the God of the Bible existing is that God unjustly commanded the killing of innocent people. But if God is the giver of life, can he also not take it away? God cannot murder, he can take life away. But what makes that just? And in the case of examining events in the Bible where God does take life, it's necessary to take careful consideration for whether or not it was in fact good or evil. And we have to understand the fact that we would be sitting in judgment of whether or not God is in fact good or just or right in the actions that he takes to take one's life. Thereby, one would have to have a morality that exists outside of oneself to make a claim on whether or not God has in fact done something that is not good. Now, how can we come to understand how this is good if taking the life of the if he's taking the life of the innocent? And perhaps if we do have more time, or if those kinds of questions come up, we'll address those. The standard of good has to be timeless. For to be in time means to change. Good cannot evolve as society changes, since there's no basis to compare the good to. It would only be what is, not what is good or bad. If good changes, becoming better or worse, depending on popular opinion, there really isn't good or bad, there's just actions. But as we can see in everyday life, good and bad truly do exist, even if the lines are blurred in some instances. Now, let me briefly state a few points about morality in anticipation of some of the objections to the moral argument from the Christian worldview. Moral law is not of herd instinct. If it were of herd, it cannot be of herd instinct, or else the stronger impulse would always win, and it does not. The moral law is not social convention. It cannot be, because not everything learned from society is based on social convention. For example, math and logic are not based on social convention. The same basic moral laws can be found in virtually every society, past and present. Further judgments about social progress would not be possible if society were the basis of judgments. Morality would be the basis of judging moral progress and not the other way around. The moral law differs from the laws of nature. Moral law is not identified with the laws of nature because nature's laws are descriptive, which would be the is aspect, and not prescriptive, which would be the ought aspect. Moral laws tell you what the oughts are and not simply what the is, if that makes sense. Factually convenient situations would be the way it is can be morally wrong. Someone who tries to trip me and fails is wrong, but someone who accidentally trips me would not be wrong. The moral law is not human fancy. That is, if it were fancy, then all value judgments would be meaningless, including such statements as hate is wrong or racism is wrong. Therefore, it cannot be based off of fancy. Now, injustice does not disprove a moral lawgiver either. The main objection to an absolutely perfect moral lawgiver is the argument from evil or injustice in the world. No serious person can fail to recognize that all murders, rapes, hatred, and cruelty in the world leave it far short of perfect. But if the world is imperfect, how can there be an absolutely perfect God? Now, C.S. Lewis answers this quite simply where he says, the only way the world can possibly be imperfect is if there is an absolutely imperfect standard by which it can be judged to be imperfect. For injustice makes sense only if there is a standard of justice by which something is known to be unjust. And absolute injustice is possible only if there is an absolute standard of justice. I've got about 3 minutes left, and I'd like to summarize with this. There is a necessity for moral absolutes, of which Orthodox Christianity has always defended moral absolutes. Moral absolutes, before the absolute nature of morality can be understood, morality must be defined. Several things are meant by moral obligation. First, a moral duty is good in and of itself. That would be the end. Not merely good as a means. Further, it's something we ought to pursue, which is a duty. Morality is the prescriptive aspect, not the descriptive aspect. It would be the ought as opposed to the is. Morality deals with what is right as opposed to what is wrong. It is an obligation that for which a person is accountable. An absolute moral obligation is an objective, not subjective moral duty, a duty for all persons, an eternal, not temporal obligation, a duty at all times, a universal, not local obligation, and a duty for all places. An absolute duty is one that is binding on all persons at all times in all places. There's a lot of defense of absolutes, and there's a lot of reasons for defenses in absolutes. There's distinctions to be made in absolutes. There's differences between the facts of what is versus the values of the oughts, which we've described. There's differences between value and instances of value. There's differences between values and understandings, between ends and means. There's differences between commands and cultures, and there's differences in applications. But let's come to the conclusion where we say that moral absolutes are unavoidable. Even those who deny them use them. The reasons for rejecting them are often based on a misunderstanding or misapplication of the moral absolute, not on a real rejection of it. That is, moral values are absolute, even if our understanding of them or the circumstances in which they should be applied are not. And then we get into a lot of other questions that people would have regarding the problem of evil, etc., but let me just wrap it up this way. At the end of the day, I think what it comes down to is this. There's three aspects of morality: governing morality, societal influence on morality, and the origination of morality. What Randy has addressed would be the governing morality and the societal influence of morality through an evolutionary perspective without any conclusion being drawn as to the origin of morality. What Randy has given you today is an epistemology of morality as opposed to an ontology of morality. The object of today's discussion and debate is supposed to be the ontology or the origin of morality. So all this to say is God's given you a real choice. You have a choice to choose between what is good and what is evil, And at the end of the day, you can go off of a subjective definition through what Randy has given you, or an objective definition of where morality has come from, which by necessity shows it must come from a moral law giver. So I want to get our debate structure back up so we can see that. We've got 10 minutes of cross-examination, and Randy's going to go first. I want to put you up on the screen as well so we can share that. And then we're going to do 10 minutes each of questions. Let me get the timer up there for 10 minutes. And sweet, okay, so we've got that, and whenever you're ready, have at it.
So I'm asking you just questions based on your opening statement?
Yeah, they can be based off the opening statement or in general. It doesn't matter to me. I would think that you'd have more questions based off what I just said, so.
Yeah, I took a bunch of notes, so I actually don't know where to start. So what I did was in my opening I went through basically a history of our planet, from single cell organisms to basically current day, and all scientists agree. I mean, I guess if you take the 1% of creation scientists out there, the Ken Hams and those people, but I mean, literally 99% of scientists agree that we've evolved that way. And within the evolution, you can clearly see the morality. And I went through the origins by how it evolved into kin selection, into social cooperation, and this is all, like I said, this is all through reading and research and stuff like that. So it's not really subjective. I definitely use external sources and listened to professors and stuff like that. Took notes and kind of connected all the dots together. I guess one of the things that and this is interesting because I would cringe when I was sitting in the pews with my kids and years ago in church, and whenever if I'm listening to the radio, and whenever I would hear like a sermon about evil proves that there must be justice. What was the other one? That was a big one. There must be ultimate justice if there's evil in the world, and then I don't know, what was the other one? That was the big one. So because I guess I always kind of cringe because I always thought, back in my mind I'm thinking like, no, that's not proof for anything. Like someone longing for justice or willing to do something doesn't make anything true. So if I need to pay my rent at the end of the month and I go to a casino and I tell the blackjack guy, hey, this is my last $50. I have a $300 rent payment due. I have to win. I have to. It's the only way. I have to. Like, he's gonna look at me like I'm crazy. So when we want, if we want something to be true, it never makes it true. So if there's an injustice that happens, it doesn't mean that something's gonna be balanced out in the end. Unless we have evidence for that, that doesn't mean that we'll ever get justice. I mean, you can look at the O.J. Simpson trial. You can look at. My wife just watched something last night about in the late 1980s about all those black men in Alabama that were put on death row and convicted based on just corrupt police. They just basically had to find someone to fill the seat, and they electrocuted them and stuff. It's a movie that just came out either on Netflix or something. That's an injustice, and there's no guarantee that will ever be righted. Now, as a society, we've corrected that. The death penalty is largely gone in the country. But I mean, there's just because that was an injustice doesn't mean there has to be ultimate justice. That doesn't prove anything. So a want or a will or a yearning or an uncomfortableness doesn't guarantee anything. So like I said, whenever I would hear that from a pulpit, that as a Christian, I would always kind of like cringe, like that doesn't prove anything. The is from the odd, so that's actually a pretty easy one. So you get an is from an odd, or you get an odd. You get an odd from an is when you have a goal. So if you take the game of chess, for instance, I'm actually at my parents' house. There's we're Polish, so from Poland we have a wooden chess game for Poland that was whittled out of by hand. That's a a board. It's a bunch of chess pieces that it's just wood. There's nothing right or wrong about it. There's nothing moral about it, except that we've made rules for that game. So now that there's goals, there are right and wrong moves for that chess game. So when you have goals, so if a goal for our planet is equality and justice, and we recognize autonomy, and we recognize that the necessity for social cooperation, had our ancestors not cooperated socially, you and I wouldn't be here discussing this. We're survivors of ancestors that recognized equality and universal liberty and morality and that. So as soon as you assign a goal, and if the facts of reality are what determines the goal on this planet, so is it wrong to walk around just bumping into people like a football player or a hockey player? What if I just walked down the street, or I went to work Monday and tomorrow and I just started bumping around people? Is that wrong? Yes, I'm violating people's equality. I'm violating their autonomy. However, what if we had a planet? I don't know if you saw the movie Interstellar, which if anyone's never seen it, I would recommend it. Fantastic movie, largely based on actual science, provable science, theoretical science. Anyway, he goes to different systems where time, an hour, because of the gravitational pull, gravity affects time. He goes to a planet where an hour on that planet is 7 years on Earth. I don't want to give away the spoiler alert, but he goes on a planet where an hour there is 7 years here, time-wise, because that planet, the mass of that planet has a larger gravitational pull. They also have frozen clouds. There's like carbon dioxide clouds that are frozen that actually bumps into them with a spaceship, things like that. So they're on a planet like that. Maybe bumping into people causes you to generate nutrition. So you bump into people, and just like plants can generate food from the sun, maybe you can generate food from nutrition from bruises or bumping into people or physical contact on a planet in a system somewhere else. So that you don't know, but the facts of reality on this planet, Earth, in this system, the solar system, dictate that bumping into people would be wrong. That you're violating their autonomy. You're violating their equality. So that's you're also infringing on their survival. So that's the facts of reality dictate the goal. The goal is what dictates the moral laws. So the other thing I would say in relation to that is Occam's razor. Simplest explanation is often the correct one, and you don't want to multiply entities unnecessarily. So to add all this theoretical stuff, like, there must be some kind of like ontological, philosophical, you're complicating things unnecessarily, you're multiplying things unnecessarily when the evidence is right in front of us. You can sit down, you can think about it, you can look at the history of civilizations, the history of biology, what we've come from. You can examine lower primates up to us, more complex primates. You can examine all that. So, and I guess the last thing I would say, I don't want to hog all the time, but one of the last things I would say is philosophy is great. It's definitely beneficial, but it's a starting point. So when you come up with a philosophy of something or a theory, you then have to empirically test it, and you need a POC, a proof of concept. I do this at work all the time when I develop a website or a software. I use a theory, a nebulous theory, say, hey, I bet we can, if we add these gamification to our member login, that we will draw more people. It's all theoretical, and then we actually have to do A/B testing. We have to prove that. Same thing with, I'm a big fan of Tesla. Take Tesla. Elon Musk sat down and said, you know what? I bet we can get away from fossil fuels. I bet we can run a car not only on electricity but on a battery. And I bet that battery could even power a car faster than a gas. Well, that's all great. That's a great theory. That's a great philosophy. Eventually, he had to sit down and start designing things, start proving things, and do a proof of concept, and then an empirical proof. So philosophy is great, but eventually that's a starting point. Eventually you have to do a test, and you can look at all the great philosophers in the past. They eventually had to go out and test things in order to validate something. So I think that covers is from an odd consciousness. I don't want to get into much other stuff until we get to that point, but I think that covers my goals. my notes from mine.
Okay, I think that, and I didn't want to interrupt you, but it was it was supposed to be our cross-examination time if you wanted to ask me questions, but
that's all right.
No, that's totally fine. What I would do, if you wanted to, whenever it's the rebuttal, whenever we get to your rebuttal time, if you want to make that your cross-examination time, that's cool too. So there's only 20 seconds left anyway. So let me get this clock up to 10 minutes, and then I will get into my questions for you. So, okay, I should have those up there. Let me see. So I want to start with about 3/4 of the way through your opening statement in your presentation. You got to what really caught my attention, and that was you gave a definition for morality. You gave a definition for a moral system. You gave a definition for moral evaluation, and then you gave a definition for what what would entail well-being within the three categories of those things. So if we could start, I want to start by asking you if you could define what morality was again, please.
Yeah, so I have like a broad, and then I have like a nuanced, more specific. But the broad was a system of ideas about right and wrong conduct. So also as a sub-definition of morality is the navigation of a species to discover what's in its own best interest. And then we assess the moral evaluation of something based on the consequences of an action with respect to a goal. Morality has to do with not only behavior but also intentions. But yeah, the broad, I think the overarching is a system of ideas about right and wrong.
Okay, so
it's the navigation of a species to discover what's in its own best interest.
Okay, now, and that would lead me to a few other questions, which I'm going to get into, but you went on to describe what that moral system itself is. Can you give me what that moral system is?
I have in my notes that well-being is the standard of morality, and the building blocks, I think might be what you're asking, is survival, equality, autonomy, and liberty.
Yeah. Okay, and then you talked about moral evaluation, which I think that you were just describing in what your definition of morality was, where you said that we assess the best interest of someone based off of a goal. So you've got an end goal, and you've got a moral evaluation based off of what that goal is. So it seems like whoever is establishing what this goal is, and whoever is establishing what the well-being of these individuals are, would be where you get your objective morality. So my question would be, who is defining for you within your worldview what well-being is for any given individual, and what the end goal is to define what that well-being is?
So it's not a who, it's a what. So the what is the facts of reality. So like I said, if
what are those?
So like, for instance, like our survival, our equality, our autonomy, our liberty. So we know we would die as a species if we didn't survive.
Right.
Survival necessitates equality, autonomy.
So how is survival related to morality? Because it seems to me that if morality evolves from the natural process of survivability, that there would be less morality, there would be less empathy, there would be less love, there would be less desire to help others survive in conjunction with us if it was all about survivability.
Nope, actually the exact opposite. And what you see in like early hominids and in like ancient times, Bronze Age, biblical times, things like that, is what you see that. What you see now is a system of cooperation, and we've learned that when you cooperate, we learn, Donald Trump notwithstanding, now with this current president, but what we learned for other presidents is if you go and you're diplomatic and negotiate, you don't have to go to arms, you don't have to fight, you don't have to risk your life. So cooperation actually lends itself to survival, where and you'll see this with chimpanzees, you'll see this with other humans. So if you and I, we live on an island, and we're working together, certain people are cooking food, certain people are hunting, certain people are foraging. Certain people are fishing. Certain people are taking care of the young. Certain people are building houses. Your survival is going to greatly increase your chance of survival. If you or I act like a jerk and we get kicked out of the tribe and we're on our own, now we have to do all those 7 things on our own, the likelihood of us dying off is a lot higher than if we were working together in a social cooperative situation.
Yeah.
So we used to believe that, yes, in the caveman times and in the biblical times and pre-biblical times, there's definitely people who believe that, but we have the advantage now to look to, Sam Harris talks about, we have these pinnacles we can stand on and look back in time and say, oh, you know what? That World War II was a terrible idea. That World War I, that Vietnam was a terrible idea, or that marginalizing people, marginalizing gays, or telling blacks they couldn't drink out of the same water fountain as you. That was really terrible. Or, raping, taking a woman to be your wife because you feel like there was a divine command for that. That was a terrible idea. This is what happened to these women. We have the benefit of looking back into time. But yes, a long time ago, what you're saying is correct. But now it's actually the opposite. Social cooperation actually lends itself to survival.
Okay, so what I'm gathering, I really want to make sure that I understand your position, so that when I get to the closing statement, I can give an accurate summary of what you believe. What I'm gathering is you're saying that through evolution, there was a development that started with chemicals that allowed for a relationship and bonding. This led to kin selection, that through time led to genes resulting in mammals sharing food, safety, bearing relationships together, like with emotional responses of empathy and sympathy and even love. There was a desire to reduce harm, to help kin, and you see this in all religions. You've seen this in all non-religions as well, with ethical theories to form the policies that affect all people. And then you talked about the development of the human cortex that takes 25 years to develop. You've got genetic mutations, and all of that led up to your argument for what morality is, your moral system, and your moral evaluation based off of the well-being of the individual. So my question remains, and I think needs to get a better understanding for how you define well-being, and what if my definition of well-being is different than your own? What if my well-being is for you to not exist? Or what if the well-being of the German Reich would be for the Jews to not exist? Who determines whose well-being is the well-being of the people, and what policies are established in order for us to determine whether or not it was in fact right or wrong?
So the goals dictate that, and when you have goals of equality and survival,
where are these goals coming from?
The facts of reality dictate that. So you're not, if you start extinguishing races and extinguishing people, and you violate them, that you're infringing on their well-being. You're.
But that seems circular to me. You're saying you're saying that the definition of the well-being of the individual is determined by the governing policies of the people who define what the well-being is, and it's based off of the well-being of the individual. That seems circular to me. It's like, well, we make policies based off of well-being, and we know what well-being is based off of our policies. So it seems to me like, what is your definition of well-being, and who is deciding what this well-being is to determine our policies?
So let me see if I have well-being defined.
And I know that, and I had quoted Sam Harris and how he defined well-being as well.
Yeah, so my notes, so well-being is universal. I remember thinking about this the other day in preparation for this. So well-being is universal, and I think actually Sam Harris talks about this. So even the religious person, even the Christian or the Muslim, so well-being is the standard, and even you would hold to it. So let me ask you, so you would not want me to go to hell, right?
No, of course not. No.
Okay, why?
Because it's in your best interest to not go to hell. But it's more than that. It's more than that. Just because I don't want you to go to hell because it's not in your interest to go there, it's because God has actually done something to intervene so you wouldn't have to go there.
But I mean, what's wrong about going to hell? It's hot there, right? Or it's torturous, or it's lonely, or it's unfulfilling, right? So it's affecting my well-being. So the problem of going to hell is I'm separated from God for all eternity. I'm unfulfilled for all eternity. Whether I'm being eaten by worms or burned by fire or just walking in darkness for all eternity, it's affecting my well-being. So well-being is a universal standard that even a religious person would hold to.
But my point is this: even when Sam Harris says, in what I quoted in my introduction, is he says the heights of happiness for the greatest number of people is the definition of well-being. But somebody is determining what the heights of happiness and morality for the reality of human flourishing would be to make it universal. So not everyone has a universal opinion on what makes them happy. Like, some people do get happy from murdering children. Some people do get happy from raping women. Some people do have a happiness from these things that is not universal. So at the end of the day, to me, it seems like the problem with that is that science doesn't establish for anyone that it's morally incumbent on them, that as opposed to just useful to them to endorse the flourishing of all. So it seems like at the end of the day, it's still your code of ethics that is not self-authenticating on what morality actually is. It's not self-authenticating. It's something that changes over time. So I guess my last question is, will morality today be the same as it was 100,000 years ago as it will be 100,000 years from today?
No, I'm actually glad you asked that. No, it'll actually be better, and that's one of my questions I'll have for you is, I don't want to give it away now, but
okay.
That's why. So we can look back, and we've evolved. Morality has evolved. It's done nothing but virtually just go in one direction. We're living the best of times in almost every measurement of times. If you read Steven Pinker's book, he has all the data to support that. The Better Angels of Our Nature. If anyone has not read that, I suggest you read it. But morality is constantly improving and constantly getting better. And I have my questions for you, and I have some examples to ask you about. So in 100 years from now, barring a natural disaster or something that, who knows what can happen if the Earth will still be here. But 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, we see morality going in one direction only. And I'll get into that later with my question for you. But I guess I was thinking when you were asking, so it's almost like I hate to say a democratic sense where people are in charge. In a sense, it's that, but more specifically, it's well-being with checks and balances. So you grant liberties. So the non-religious, the secular view is that you grant all liberties, and then you start to restrict as they affect other people. So you grant all. So, and what religious does is basically is virtually the opposite, where you grant nothing, and then you kind of like, let's see if this is okay. Let's one thing at a time. Where the secular view is you grant liberties and you scale back from there as it infringes on people's rights. So it's well-being with checks and balances. So if well-being for me is to go for a great run tomorrow morning before work, and well-being for a guy down the street is to rape small children, that's if we both get pleasure out of that, that's fine. But you have checks and balances where if I run tomorrow, it affects nobody. As long as I make it to work on time, it affects nobody if I go for a run. If he's raping children or women, you're violating. There's inequality there. There's suffering potentially. There's you're violating their autonomy. So those checks and balances are in place. That's why I mentioned those checks and balances. So it's well-being is the pinnacle. And like I said, I could argue that it's also the pinnacle for religious people too. But but the survival, equality, autonomy, liberty is like the checks and balances. So yes, that's when my well-being or yours versus Hitler's, or a sense of flourishing or I forget what you use, happiness, ultimate flourishing or happiness. I think you said Sam Harris uses. So your ultimate happiness and mine is both open until we start violating. Until we hit a checks and balance where we're violating someone's survival, their equality, their autonomy, their liberty.
Awesome.
That's
really helpful.
Yeah.
Dude, no, that's really helpful. I appreciate that. Until we start infringing on other people. Okay. So yeah, you did 10 minutes of rebuttal on that last round. Do you want to do 7 minutes of cross-examination? Would that work for you now?
Yeah.
Okay. And clock is up, so whenever you're ready.
All right, so I kind of gave away my first question, but so our views about right and wrong have changed clearly. If the source of morality is divine, why has our morality progressed? If the Ten Commandments, for instance, were suffice, why did we have to come up with the concept of democracy, and the UN have to come up with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? So the UDHR, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that came up by the United Nations in 1948, it set out for the first time fundamental human rights to be universally protected, and it has been translated in over 500 languages.
Yeah. No, that's a good question, man. And I think at the end of the day, the fundamental difference between your view and my view is going to come down to this point right here, and it's related to the first question you just asked me. Why is morality, why does it seem to change over time, and why do we have to establish them in governing policies, essentially is what I'm hearing in the question. Did I hear that correctly? Is that kind of a good summary?
Yeah, so for instance, and I have just a side note. Well, I have a part B to that, but so I have a note that says, if we look across the last 5,000 years, it's clear that moral standards have improved in most of the world. For example, rape, slavery is now widely outlawed. Children are protected from forced marriage. Minorities are protected from discrimination. Gay people are no longer killed. Women are able to hold positions of leadership. Interracial marriage is now allowed. Death penalty is largely abolished. The only place we see no moral growth is in religious fundamental areas like certain parts of the United States, Uganda, Iraq, Syria. So you clearly see just the moral arc going in one direction on this planet.
Yeah,
So
I'm sure that you've got more questions. I don't want to take all your time on this one. Let me give a summary of what my position is. I think the Christian perspective is that we do have moral absolutes. So that means that morality is going to remain the same 100,000 years ago today as it will be 100,000 years from today. And you took the position that it wouldn't be because it changes based off of a lot of different factors that we spent a lot of time to talk about. And I'm grateful for that. It could get better. Yeah. So my point is this: morality is going to stay the same. Now, why do we have these societal changes and these political changes and these governing changes, like what you see in racism and in women's rights and the rights of minorities in America, of what it was 100 years ago or even 50 years ago to what it is today? And what the Christian perspective says on that is the moral absolute has remained the same. The discoverability of those morals is something that is intrinsically a part of humanity, but something that does take time to incorporate into the governing policies and all of those things. It's not that the morality of women or the equality of women and minorities in America somehow changed in the last 100 years. The Christian worldview says, no, the minorities in America were just as valuable as they were before those political changes happened. In your worldview, you would have to say, well, the majority decided that they were of equal value now when they decided they weren't of equal value before. What we're saying is we've discovered that they were of equal value, and it was something that was outside of us, that was greater than us, to reveal to us that they were, in fact, of equal value. And I think it creates more of a problem in your worldview to say, no, you know what, the minorities were not, they objectively, morally, were not of equal value because the policies reflected that it had all the ways that it affects people and infringing on their liberties, their rights, and their quality. But over time, it's changed to what it is today, and now it's better than it was yesterday. Because of that. So to me, I can look back in history and say, no, we were wrong because we were objectively wrong as a society. And that's something that's greater than us and outside of us. But that would be my answer to that. There's a lot more to be said on it. But yeah, if you want to go on to the next question, that'd be great. Or if you want to follow up, that's cool too.
Yeah, I guess I can, because I don't have a huge closing, so I guess I can add some of this to my closing. But I also want to give you a chance to respond. So that's a hard sell for me, only because you have like 10 Commandments, you have other Jewish laws and that, and it could easily have, someone could have easily put, God could easily put in the Bible, said, listen, it's wrong to own someone as property under any circumstances. it's wrong to not have a woman speak in any kind of formal setting. It's wrong for people to deny interracial marriage. It's wrong to rape a woman, whether she's a spoil of war, whether she's, whether you need her as a wife. It's always wrong. And it seems like we had to fight for that, as opposed to having that from the start.
Okay. Okay, so I've got a minute and a half to give an answer on this. Let me do the best that I can in a minute and a half, and I'll just say it this way. When we talk about a person being the property of another person, or we talk about a man raping a woman as a spoil of war, or we talk about the rights of a woman to be able to stand up and speak, or we talk about what people commonly would characterize as genocide in the Bible at the command of God, and we talk about these sorts of things, we have to understand that we've got to be extremely careful, whether you're a Christian or a non-Christian. I would say that even you don't want to misrepresent what the Christian worldview is, and when it comes to these passages. So I think that when we're talking about slavery, and we're talking about one person owning another person as property, we have to understand the context of what we're talking about. When people hear the word slavery today, you think chattel slavery, of the colonial, the American historical perspective on what chattel slavery was. That is not the slavery of the Bible. The slavery of the Bible was an economic system of what we would call indentured servitude. And it's no different today. It's seemingly no different today than you signing a contract to go work for someone in exchange for monetary value. Now, if you sign a contract to whatever it is that you do for a living, Randy, if you sign a contract that you're going to do something for somebody in this case, and in return, they're going to give you this in return, that is very similar. That would take a lot of time to break down and what it was like in the Bible. And there's so much that we would have to do to break that down and what the differences are, especially when it comes to the idea of one person owning another person as a possession. The Bible describes that possession as being their monies, and not being someone who had a right over them as like they would a piece of farm equipment, but the right over them that it's kind of a contractual basis, because there were punishments for how the master or the owner or the person who owns that contract was to treat that individual. Say that the owner or the master, the whatever you want to call them, gave that slave a black eye or knocked out a tooth. The same was to be required of the master, or he had to set him free. If he were to kill his slave, his life would be required for killing him. Now, you get into some of these what we call case law situations in the Old Testament, and it takes a lot of time to decipher. When what I see a lot of the time is agnostics and atheists and skeptics. I'm not saying you in particular, because honestly, I don't think that you would do this. A lot of these people do drive-by, what I call drive-by shootings, when it comes to not literal drive-by shootings, but a drive-by like genocide, slavery references like this, that this is the Christian worldview, or this is the God of the Old Testament, and that is not the case whatsoever. And that's where I'm like, you know what, we got to look at these in a case-by-case basis. A lot of these situations were the judicial system of the nation of Israel. That would be what we would call in America the judicial system of our Constitution, with case law situations. Like, if this happens, here's how you handle it in this situation. This is what's right in this situation. This is what's wrong in the outcome of this situation. But when we're talking about that in respect to the origin of morality, that's totally different, man. It's totally different, and it would take time to break that down, which we don't have. But and I took too much time to answer that, but you've only asked 2 questions, so if you want to ask me one more, I'm totally open to that.
Yeah, I guess at some point we should get into that, because I purposely used my words carefully. Yeah. So I found contexts where God was instructing people to ravish the women, and that's translated to rape. It even talks about them telling him to sneak up behind women and take them for their wives. It also tells them to take the virgins and not the ones that have known a man. And then in Exodus 21, it talks about how you can beat your slave as long as they don't die within a day or 2. Now, I've heard like a slavery being back then, just like as if I were to go play for the Kansas City Chiefs. I'm under a contract, I can be traded, I can blah, blah.
Yeah.
and with all due respect, that's not even close. Patrick Mahomes could walk off the field at any time and go home and never play football again. He could never talk to the owner again. He could never talk to Andy Reeves again. He can do whatever he wants. They also don't have the ability to beat him as long as he doesn't die within a day or two. So it's not even close. And there was even different. It talked about that. There was two sets of rules. So there was a separate set of rules for Jewish slaves and a separate set of rules for non-Jewish slaves. It's the more you dig into it, the worse it gets. But I mean, there should never be a point in history where owning a person as property, any context where that's allowable. And like I said, that the analogies that I've heard drawn to, like, that's just like a software developer or a football player. The football player has the ability to walk off the field, never play football again, and never be beaten, never be owned as property, never be let go after 7 years unless they marry a slave woman. Then they're the slave owner's property forever. It's like there's a lot more. Like, I don't want to go off on a huge rabbit trail, but I purposely didn't. I don't do a drive-by, about the Amalekites and genocide, and it's no different than the Nazis. Like, I hate when people do that. That's ridiculous. But I picked my words very carefully with the slavery and the, you have with the inequality. You also have. So like in 1845, Southern Baptist Convention split away from the church after Northern Baptists refused to allow slave owners to become missionaries. So I mean, not only do you have an understanding of slavery, but you also have people even as recent as 1845, like, splitting away from that. And then you have in 1967, the Supreme Court struck down bans on interracial marriage in Virginia. 16 states still had such laws. So I mean, it's kind of like I don't want to go all over the place, but it's a little. Maybe we could talk about slavery at some point. We could have a discussion on that, or we could have a debate on that, because I've heard your side of it, and it's not satisfying the more you dig into it. But just to get into the part B of my question, because I know we're running out of time here, and it's directly related. So if morality has a divine source, why have religions become more moderate? Judaism and Christianity are two examples, and we are seeing a movement right now for Islam to follow. They're becoming more moderate. Female genital mutilation is no longer widely practiced. Honor killings are becoming less and less. Women driving are being allowed. Burqa and hijab leniency, we're seeing that. So the arc has always headed in one direction. So if morality has a divine source, why are religions becoming more moderate? Why are we no longer burning witches? In 1555, I have a thing where Rowan Taylor was executed due to heresy. He told the church that the communion was not the actual body and blood of Jesus Christ. And February 9th, 1555, he appeared with two others before Bishop of Winchester. He was charged with heresy and dividing the church. They put a black hood over his head in a crowded street, and they tied him to a stake and burned him to the stake. So you have, as recent as 1555, the 16th century, you have radical Christianity. You currently have radical Islam. It's what was starting to be moderated. Like I said, they passed a driving law just in December, maybe in the United Arabic Emirates, that Arabic women are now able to drive. So I guess, like I said, to recap, if morality has a divine source, why are religions becoming more moderate?
Yeah. Okay, so we've got 3 minutes left for our open dialogue, and then we're going to go to 3-minute closing statements. What I would say is I don't have any idea what what you're looking at when you say that religion is getting more moderate. And give me a chance to explain here, because what I see is I see things becoming a lot more extreme. I do see it kind of an effort to find commonality between religions, but I also see the extremes of religions becoming more extreme. I see a lot of that over in the African nations, in the Middle Eastern nations, and it seems like the majority of what we're talking about, tolerance, is becoming actually more intolerant towards the Christians. And if I don't know if you know this or not, but the most persecuted religion in the world is Christianity today. I mean, Christians are being killed all over the place around the world. but you also see an increase of people becoming Christians around the world, and it's in extreme cases. If you look at what it's like to become a Christian coming out of Islam or Judaism, you are disowned, and in some cases you're sentenced to death. It's illegal to preach from a Christian Bible in many nations across the world. That's why I'm saying I don't understand what you're looking at. I think if we're looking at a standard for morality, the Christian worldview is going to say, you know what was moral 100,000 years ago, or if you're a young Earth creationist, 6,000 years ago, as to what it is today, and as what it will be 6,000 years from now. And when we're looking, we would have to, I think that we do need to come back to that, some of the slavery or some of the Old Testament examples that you brought up that really, I think, need a lot more delicacy and a lot more intricate detail and conversation about from the Christian worldview to give an explanation for what we believe about those specific scenarios. But those are the things that I'm looking at to say, well, what is the objective standard of morality? Because your worldview says that it could change, it will be different. And if in fact your worldview says the church was wrong, Catholic Church was wrong to do what you described happening, in that example that you gave, or the Southern Baptist Convention doing what you described they did in the 1800s, I would say they are wrong. I'm not a Roman Catholic. When I look at my heritage of Christians, the Roman Catholic Church is not a Christian church. It never has been. It never has been. The Roman Catholic Church has persecuted the heritage of my people, that we literally have books written about it called The Trail of Blood, The Martyr's Mirror, on reflections of what has happened in the persecution of people who believe the Bible and that morality is what it is, and that it's not going to change. So when we talk about morality and we talk about what's right or wrong, you don't have a standard to define like this is right or wrong, because if the majority decides and the policies decide that this is right, you would have to go with it. You would have to say this is objectively right, because one, this is what society has decided, and two, it creates the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, in the way that you defined equality, diversity, not infringing on the right of someone else. But what troubled me the most about what you said was, and I want to find this quote, what troubled me the most was when you said if we both like raping babies and we both like raping women, that's fine, but there is inequality there and infringing on someone else's rights. It's the survival, equity, autonomy, and the reality that changes over time to give us our moral code. That is very troubling to me. You say that raping babies and raping women is fine. You don't have an objective standard to say it's wrong, except for the fact that it is inequity to the person that it's being infringed upon. So when we're talking about well-being, that's where it becomes really deeply troubling for me to be able to go to adopt your worldview, to get to the point that you could say, if the majority decided this was fine or relative or the well-being for the person, who are we taking into account? It gets really complicated there. So let's go and jump into our.
If I could just have like 30 seconds. So, yeah, that's a misquote. We can obviously when the podcast comes out, you can hear me. So I was giving an example. I said about checks and balances. You said, well, what if a person's idea of pleasure is this and someone else is that? I said so Monday morning, if I decide to go for a run, and that's extreme happiness for me, and then if someone decides to go rape a woman or a child, and that's extreme happiness to them, we have checks and balances. My going for a run affects nobody as long as I get to work on time Monday morning. Someone going to rape a child or a woman affects the woman, affects her autonomy, affects her equality, affects her liberty, affects her rights. That's why it's wrong. You're asking, I didn't say that was right. Those are the reasons in a secular worldview, without some kind of deistic type of overlord. That's why it's wrong, because you're violating someone. So that's why I said, because you said, yeah. What if someone decides? So I was showing that I enjoy running, and this person apparently enjoys violating people. Why is it wrong? Because the religious objection is, well, without a God, how do you know what's wrong? Anyone could just no. We have checks and balances. You can't. If we both enjoy, if I enjoy drinking beer and this other person enjoys drinking blood of goats, and they're going and they're slaughtering everyone's goats, it's wrong because you're violating someone's property. It's there's checks and balances that can be put in place easily.
Okay, so I don't want to misquote you, so yeah, I would have to go back and listen to it. That's what I typed in as you were saying it, so maybe I typed it in wrong, and that's totally fine. I hope I did hear you wrong on that. So
yeah.
Let's go to our 3-minute closing statements, and I'll let you have it first, and then I'll go after you.
All right. Yeah, I actually didn't type one out. I was hoping to. I have a couple sentences, but I was hoping to kind of build one based on the notes and that. But let's see. So I have a divine-based morality is destructive to humans. Theists actually bear the burden of proof of being immoral. With theism, morality is reduced to mere obedience. We are now simply following orders from a grand master dictator. That is not being moral. It's actually abdicating moral responsibility. It's abdicating the conscious drive of moral deliberation. Being obedient is not moral. It's the abdication of morality. It's moral outsourcing. So if two people go out for dinner and their child misbehaves, and when you get home, one set of parents tells the child, "Hey, next time we go out to eat, if you behave, I'll give you a treat. If you misbehave, you're going to get a spanking." And if another family goes and tells a child, "Hey, listen, there's a reason people go out, they're trying to enjoy a meal. You're disrupting their meal, you're infringing on their freedom, on their rights. Think if you put yourself in their place, if you were trying to enjoy a meal, why, you wouldn't want someone screaming in your ear or jumping around or knocking plates over or this and that. Next time those two families go out to dinner, they might get the same result, but one child's going to be more moral than the other child. The other child's doing it because we're dangling carrots. The other child is doing it because there's someone watching over them and there's a reward system. It's more moral if you understand empathy, if you exercise empathy and compassion and equality. So that's basically my closing. I believe a secular moral system and a moral system that has goals in mind, and basically the facts of reality dictate the goals. So what we know exists. We know this reality exists. We know it hurts to bump into other people. We know that social cooperation lends itself to a more moral society, a more productive society, a survival. Having a wishful thinking that there's going to be some kind of something in the end, in the next game, that's going to balance out the justice system, and that's great. It's if that helps some people get through their day, that's wonderful. But we see society moving to an evidence-based system where we want to know for the here and now, for right now, how do we get along? How do we survive? How do we have equality? How do marginalized people? How do minorities? How do gays? How do handicapped people? How do we protect them? How do we ensure their equality? How do we ensure their liberty? How do we treat them as other humans? Well, the facts of reality dictate that. We have mirror neurons. We can put ourselves in their position and say, listen, if I was in a wheelchair, if I was handicapped, if I only had one leg, if I was a minority, if I was in that situation, how would I want to be treated? So that system of ideas about right and wrong conduct, and being able to look back in the past and see how people did it wrong, and as morality keeps evolving. And I wanted to say that yes, morality will change. It will change for the better. So in 10 years, it'll be better than it was today. In 20 years, it'll be better than it was 10 years from now. You see the moral arc going in one direction. If you read Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, he shows that we are living in the best of times. We are more civilized. We are healthier than any other era of any society ever, and it keeps heading in one direction. So that in closing, like I said, I believe moralities come from a system of ideas about right and wrong. I believe that well-being is a standard of morality, and that the checks and balances of that morality, as we see as evidence, are survival, equality, autonomy, and liberty. They're the building blocks and the guide to morality, and they dictate the goal. If our goal is to survive, to give people liberty and autonomy and equality, that ensures their well-being, and their well-being is a standard, and that's why we've seen society progress to the point it has today. Why we're not we're not enslaving people. That's okay. I can wrap up there. That's okay.
Okay, I'm going to go into, let me get the camera back on me. My wife has got to go. I'm going to do my 3 minutes and then jump off here real quick. So let me say this. I'm not going to change the timer, but I'm just going to take the 3 minutes the best I can to the best of my ability. What the point of the conversation tonight was supposed to be was the origin of morality. What we've heard tonight from Randy's perspective is the discoverability of what morality is and how morality changes. He hasn't actually given an explanation for the origin of morality outside of extremely skeptical premises that are unverifiable. He says that the facts of reality determine the goals determine the policies dictate what is right for the greatest good, and it only gets better over time. And I hope that you guys can see, for those of you who are still watching or those that you will watch later, that this is absolutely 100% totally a subjective point of view here. There's no objectivity to it. And I hope that you guys can see that. I hope that you can see why it's so imperative for the necessity of the defense of absolutes, moral absolutes. Without moral absolutes, you have no ability to actually say this is right or this is wrong. What you can say is this is not right nor wrong, but it's actually causing harm or infringing upon someone else's rights, so you shouldn't do this. But you cannot actually, in fact, objectively say this is wrong. And in fact, that's going to change over time. So say over time society does say it's okay to rape babies. So sometime over time the majority of the goal is to get rid of the Jews, that it does become policy, that it does actually go into policy, that people act on it. And that actually did happen. We can look back on those things and say, no, this was objectively morally wrong, whether or not the majority agreed on it, whether or not society agreed on it, whether or not the policies said it was right or wrong, because it was objectively wrong. And I think that it doesn't actually get better over time. What we can see in morality is that the morals of America and the morals of the world is actually getting worse. When we've lost our perspective on who the moral lawgiver is, and we've lost our perspective on what morality is, it all becomes totally subjective and relative to whatever you think it should be. And that's where we're talking about the differences between a what is and an ought. We're talking about a duty versus a necessity, and in relative to what morality is and the origin of morality. So I think that when we consider what Randy's position is and we consider what my position is on the origin of morality, you can either say that it came about through evolutionary means that has not been proven tonight, that there is highly unlikely that it literally came from purified chemicals that had to have been purified in pure chemicals to start something from nothing that violates the own laws of nature that we see within nature itself, to get to the point that we have a sentient being, of which Randy has not offered any explanation for where sentience comes from, where consciousness comes from. And at the end of the day, if you are going to take the naturalist perspective through an evolutionary biological process, you have no reason to trust what you are actually doing in the first place, because it's all determined through a chemical process with molecules in motion, and you're only dancing to your DNA. You have no evidence of yourself being conscious. You have no evidence of you yourself having a free will to be able to choose between right and wrong, because you can't identify what right and wrong is in the first place. You're just doing what your nature tells you should do. So with that said, guys, I hope that you can consider and really weigh between the two options and come to a rational conclusion that it is morally objective to say that God is the moral lawgiver. So with that said, guys, I'm going to wrap it up. My wife is telling me she's got to go. My daughter's coming up to me right now. So we're going to cut out, and I'll give you an update online for what to expect in the next few weeks. But there are some exciting things coming around the corner. So anyways, Randy, let me put you back on the screen. It's good to have you on again, and I appreciate you coming on. Maybe we can look at in the future doing something to talk about slavery or kind of Old Testament passages that you would say are probably not morally good. So I don't know. We'll see. But anyways, thanks for coming on again. God bless, and we'll talk to you sometime soon, man.
Thank you.
Thanks. All right. Bye, guys.